April 16th, 1945, Weimar, Germany. On a sunny spring morning, 1,000 of Germany's wealthiest citizens were forced to take a walk they would never forget. If you looked at the road leading out of the city, you would see something strange. A parade. Men in expensive suits and fedora hats, women in fur coats wearing lipstick and high heels. They were chatting, they were smiling, some were even laughing. They looked like they were going to a garden party. But flanking them on both sides were American soldiers, grim-faced, dirty, fingers on the triggers of their M1 Garands. The soldiers weren't smiling. They were marching these fine citizens up a hill 5 miles away, toward a place the citizens claimed they knew nothing about, a place called Buchenwald. The Germans complained as they walked. "Why are we doing this? This is an outrage. My shoes are getting dusty." They thought it was propaganda. They thought the Americans were exaggerating. They believed they were innocent. But General George S. Patton had seen the camp 2 days earlier. He had seen the ovens. He had seen the zoo the SS built while prisoners starved. And he had decided that the innocence of Weimar was a lie. He wanted to shatter it. They say they didn't know. Fine, let's take them on a tour. This is the story of the Parade of Shame. It is the story of how the cultural capital of Germany became the neighbor of hell. And it is the story of the moment the smiles died on the faces of the German elite forever. To understand the horror of Buchenwald, we first have to understand the beauty of Weimar. Weimar wasn't just any German city. It was the soul of Germany, the city of Goethe, the city of Schiller, the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement, a city of libraries, theaters, and parks. The people who lived there prided themselves on being civilized. They listened to Beethoven. They read philosophy. They believed they were the pinnacle of European culture. And every single day for 8 years, they pretended not to smell the smoke. Just 5 miles away, up a scenic tree-lined road, was a factory of death. Buchenwald concentration camp was established in 1937. For 8 years it operated right under the noses of the Weimar elite. The SS officers lived in nice houses in the suburbs. Their wives shopped in Weimar's boutiques. They went to the same concerts. The smoke from the crematorium floated over the city. The ashes settled on their windowsills. And yet, when the Americans arrived, the citizens said the same 4 words. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We knew nothing. They claimed the smoke was from a factory. They claimed the skinny men working on the railroad were volunteers. They lived in a bubble of denial. On April 11th, 1945, the bubble burst. The U.S. Third Army arrived. When Patton's tanks rolled in, the SS fled. The prisoners who were still alive took control of the camp. Patton arrived a few days later. He had already seen Ohrdruf. He thought he was prepared. He wasn't. Buchenwald was massive. 20,000 prisoners were still there. Walking skeletons. Men who weighed 60 pounds. Children who had forgotten how to smile. Patton walked through the gates. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw. It was what he smelled. Death. Old death. The kind that soaks into the ground and never leaves. Then he saw the bodies. Hundreds of them. Stacked like firewood in the courtyard. Naked, yellow-skinned, eyes still open. Patton was a tough man. Old blood and guts. But this broke him. He turned away and vomited. He wrote in his diary that night, "I have never felt so sick in my life. This is not war. This is madness." But what made him angry, truly angry, was what he saw when he looked down the hill. German civilians, in the fields below the camp, plowing their land, hanging their laundry, living their lives like nothing was wrong. The smell of death was so strong that American soldiers were vomiting in the ditches, but the Germans kept working, kept pretending. Patton turned to the camp commandant. "Do the people in that town know about this?" "They say they don't, General." Patton's face turned red. He slammed his riding crop against his boot. "They are lying," he said, "and I am going to prove it." Patton called the provost marshal. He gave an order that was unique in the history of warfare. He didn't want just the mayor. He wanted the cream of the crop. "Find the richest people," Patton said. "The professors, the lawyers, the businessmen, the politicians' wives. Round up 1,000 of them." The MPs went into Weimar. They knocked on doors of grand villas. They walked into shops. "You are going for a walk. Put on your coats. General Patton invites you to visit your neighbors." The Germans were confused. Some were indignant. "I am a doctor," one man shouted. "You cannot order me around." The MP pointed his rifle. "Start walking." It was a strange sight, 1,000 well-dressed civilians marching up the hill. The Americans drove jeeps alongside them to make sure no one escaped. The mood among the Germans was light. They were chatting. Some women were fixing their hair. They treated it like an inconvenience, a silly American game. They smiled at the cameras. They had no idea what was waiting at the top of the hill. The march took 2 hours. As they climbed higher, the conversation stopped. The wind shifted, and the smell hit them. Not just rotting flesh, old death, stale, heavy, greasy. It stuck to the back of your throat. One woman said later, "I tasted it before I smelled it." The women stopped smiling. They pulled out handkerchiefs, perfumed scarves, but the MPS pushed them forward. "Keep moving, no stopping." They reached the main gate, the famous iron gate of Buchenwald. The inscription read, "Jedem das Seine," to each his own, a cruel Nazi joke. The civilians walked through, and they stepped into hell. The first thing they saw was the prisoners. Thousands of them, standing behind barbed wire, silent, watching. These were the men the civilians claimed didn't exist. They stared at the fur coats and the fedora hats. Their eyes were dead. But that stare was alive with accusation. They didn't scream. They didn't attack. They just stared. And that stare was more terrifying than any weapon. The American soldiers formed a cordon. They guided the civilians toward the first stop, the crematorium. In the courtyard was a trailer piled high with bodies, naked, emaciated bodies, limbs tangled together, mouths open in silent screams. The civilians stopped. The color drained from their faces. One woman in a fur coat put her hand to her mouth. She started to shake. Then she screamed. She fainted, collapsed into the mud. An American MP stepped forward. He didn't help her up. He nudged her with his boot. "Get up," he said. "You haven't seen anything yet." This was the moment the lie of the good German was destroyed. History books often soften these details. We don't. If you believe the truth must be told, no matter how ugly, hit that subscribe button. Help us keep history alive. Now, let's go inside. The Americans forced the civilians to walk past the bodies. They forced them to look. If a man turned his head away, a soldier would grab his chin and turn it back. "Look!" they shouted. "Look at what you did!" They led them inside a building, the Pathology Lab. The SS kept medical records, but they also kept souvenirs. On a table, displayed like items in a shop window, were the artifacts of the SS. 2 shrunken heads of Polish prisoners, preserved, pieces of tattooed human skin. The commandant's wife, Ilse Koch, the bitch of Buchenwald, liked tattoos. She would order prisoners with interesting tattoos to be killed so she could make lampshades out of their skin. An American officer pointed at the lampshade. "This was a man," he said in German. "He had a family, he had a name, and you went to parties by his light." The civilians stared at the table. The men in suits were weeping openly now. Some were vomiting in the corner. An American officer stood by the table. He spoke perfect German. "You say you didn't know? These were made here, in your backyard, while you went to the theater, while you drank your coffee." The civilians had no answer. Their denial had been stripped away. They were naked in their guilt. The tour continued. They saw the little camp, the quarantine zone where prisoners were left to die of typhus. The stench was so bad that even the American soldiers wore masks. But the civilians were not allowed masks. They had to breathe it in. A former prisoner, a skeleton of a man, walked up to a well-dressed German banker. He pointed a shaking finger at him. "I remember you," the prisoner said. "I worked at the train station. I saw you. You saw me. You looked away." The banker broke down. He fell to his knees. "I didn't know. I didn't know," he sobbed. But nobody believed him, not even himself. By the time the tour ended, the 1,000 citizens of Weimar were destroyed. They walked out of the gate in silence. No one was chatting. No one was smiling. The women's makeup was streaked with tears. The men's suits were dusty. They walked back down the hill, back to their beautiful city of poets. But the city would never look the same. Every time they looked at that hill, they would see the bodies. When Eisenhower heard about Patton's tour, he didn't reprimand him. He expanded the order. He realized what Patton did was essential. He sent a cable to Washington and London. "Send the press, send the congressmen, send the parliament members, send the editors." He wanted witnesses. He famously said, "The things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Eisenhower knew people would try to deny the Holocaust. He knew that 50 years later, people would say it never happened. So he forced the Germans to be the witnesses against themselves. The impact was immediate. That night in Weimar, the shame was too much for some. Several prominent citizens who had been on the tour committed suicide in the days that followed. They realized their culture, their education, their civilization had failed to stop them from becoming monsters. They couldn't live with the reflection in the mirror. Patton was told about the suicides. He didn't celebrate, but he didn't mourn either. He simply said, "Good. Maybe the rest of them will learn." The forced tour of Buchenwald is a moment history should never forget. It raises a question we still ask today. How much does the average citizen know about the crimes of their government? The people of Weimar weren't pulling the trigger. They weren't turning on the gas. But they were the ones who looked away. they were the ones who stayed silent. Patton understood that silence is complicity. He understood that you cannot claim innocence just because you closed your eyes. On that day in April 1945, he forced them to open their eyes. And in doing so, he forced the world to open its eyes too. The citizens of Weimar walked up that hill as arrogant aristocrats. They walked down as broken accomplices, and the ghosts of Buchenwald followed them home. The excuse, "we didn't know," is still used today. Do you think the citizens really didn't know? Or were they lying to protect themselves? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see the story of how American soldiers took revenge on the SS guards at Dachau, that video is coming next. Click subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.